In the lab activity, on the study guide material at the end of the lab activity where I have various blood pressure relationships, I mean various atrial pressure and ventricular pressure, there's also a table that doesn't look exactly like this, but you'll see one similar on the lecture exam. By now you've learned that when I say something will be on the test, it will be on the test. So it won't look quite like this one, but it will look more like the one that you have in the lab activity. And so let me just put something up on the board. So if we have a list of events, sympathetic activity, acetylcholine, venous return, diuretic, heart rate, calcium channel blockers, okay, and then over on this side we put venous return, heart contractile force, stroke volume, end diastolic volume, cardiac output, stroke volume, okay? And those can be in any order. And increase, decrease, or no change. So if I increase all of these components, what would be the effect? So if I increase sympathetic activity, what would be the effect on venous return?
Increase.
That's kind of a little touchy, because we're increasing heart rate. Okay, and increasing heart rate means that we have less time for ventricular filling, but it also means we have increased stroke output, which is increasing venous return. So overall, the effect of increased sympathetic activity is going to be increase in venous return. Okay, what about increase in acetylcholine on contractile force? So if we increase the amount of acetylcholine at the heart, what effect would that have on contractile force of the heart? Acetylcholine bind to our ventricles? No. So, no change. Now if I had norepinephrine, we would have an increase in contractile force. Okay? But with acetylcholine, there's no change. Increase in venous return? What effect would that have on stroke volume? Increase. Okay? Diuretics. Diuretics make you go to the bathroom more. Number 1? I don't have little kids anymore, so I don't remember which is 1, which is 2. You're going to pee more often, all right, if you take a diuretic. So if I take a diuretic, what effect is that going to have on my end diastolic volume? If I pee out more, I'm going to have less blood volume. So if I have less blood volume, I'm going to have less venous return. If I have less venous return, I'm going to have a lower end diastolic volume. So that's going to decrease. Okay? If my heart rate goes up, what's going to happen to my cardiac output? It's going to go up as well. Now eventually, I might see no change because my stroke volume would decrease or whatever. So I'm not talking about way down the line, I'm talking about its immediate effect. So heart rate goes up, cardiac output goes up. Calcium channel blockers. I take a blood pressure medication, like Rapamil. I take a calcium channel blocker. What's going to happen to stroke volume? It's going to go down, okay, because contractility is going to go down. So you'll see a table like that or a chart like that on the lecture exam. We're just kind of figuring out if I have this, what happens or doesn't happen. Okay? And again, we'll be looking at blood pressure when we do blood vessels because we'll have another aspect for that. Now, I don't think this is in your lecture notes, but it is on the PowerPoint. And it is, if you have Dr. Martinez or someone else that did concept mapping, really just a form of concept mapping. It looks scary because there's so much on one part of it, on one piece of paper. But it's essentially a summary of what we've covered so far with the heart and cardiac output. So down here at the very bottom says cardiac output. Two things we talked about today that cover or affect cardiac output. One is stroke volume, one is heart rate. Okay? So now what's in red is going to decrease stroke volume, what's in green is going to increase stroke volume. So if we increase in diastolic volume, that increases stroke volume. If we decrease in diastolic volume, that's going to decrease stroke volume. So what factors affect in diastolic volume? Venous return. So far, these are familiar words, okay? Venous return and contractility. What affects venous return? Blood volume. What affects blood volume? Kidney activity, okay? Which we'll talk about on Tuesday in a week. Not next Tuesday, but the following Tuesday. We'll look very briefly at some of the hormones that affect the kidney. But that's where the diuretics come from that we just mentioned, okay? Here's the muscular pump. I was talking about walking and squeezing your veins, okay? If we lose blood, hemorrhage, when you find somebody by the side of the road and they've had their leg amputated and they're bleeding out from the femoral artery, what's their heart rate going to be, up or down?
Up.
What's the force of the contraction going to be? Down. Why?
Because it's not stretched.
There's not very much, well, by force of contraction, I meant the force of the pulse.
Right.
The pulse is going to be weak because there's not much blood actually going out. So as blood is going out, what's happening to venous return? It's dropping, therefore stroke volume is dropping as well. And because stroke volume is dropping, heart rate is going up, okay? So this is just tying all of that together. Heart rate increases with sympathetic activity, increases both heart rate and contractility, just like we talked about from that slide a few moments ago. Contractility is affected by hormones and calcium, okay? And blood volume also is going to affect the nervous system is going to respond to that. So this is just kind of tying all those different factors together that we've covered that affect heart rate and contractility, putting it kind of all into one concise place. Okay? So it's a if this, then that type of a sequence that you're looking at here. So that's on the PowerPoint slides. And again, we'll add the peripheral resistance aspect to blood pressure in a couple of, about 10 days. So, which of the following functions to increase in diastolic volume? In other words, increase venous return. Diuresis? Increase urine output? No. That will lower blood volume, which will lower venous return, which will lower in diastolic volume, which will lower stroke volume. Okay? Increase exercise?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Increase sweating? No. Because again, fluid loss. Okay? pressure? Yes. Okay, because it's increasing venous return. Also, with high blood pressure, we have an increase in afterload, which means more blood stays in the ventricles, which means that more blood is there when the AV valve's open, so even more blood is there after blood's flowing back into the ventricles. Okay? So this is one of the, people ask me at the end of aisle 430, is 431 harder or easier than 430? And it kind of depends. If you like to think things through, there's not as much of the memorization and more of the logic. If this, then this. If this, then this. And if you understand it, you don't forget that understanding as easily as you do memorizing just, a list of 20 different random phone numbers. Like learning the names of bones or muscles can be. For some people, they love to memorize. They love to learn the names of things that they can touch and hold. And it's difficult to do the thinking through. Other people hate just sitting down and forcing their brain to remember random facts. And they like to be able to link information, and therefore once they can see the overall picture, they can figure everything out, they know it. So it kind of depends on what your brain is used to doing and whether you find it easier or not. So again, the hormones, the sodium and stuff, we'll go over this first thing on Tuesday after you've had a chance to do the Physio X activity. And now I want to finish up just by talking about a couple of conditions, pathologies on page 66. And then we'll take a break and do that. So atherosclerosis and arteriosclerosis are related but are two separate things. Atherosclerosis refers to the increase of lipid material in blood vessels. You may have heard of plaques. Interestingly enough, the fatty plaques are not along the surface of the blood. You're not going to open up a blood vessel and be able to touch fatty deposits. It's not like the inside of your blood vessels get caked with cholesterol and lipids. That lipid material actually appears within the smooth muscle cells that are just below the surface. So the lining of the blood vessel has scattered smooth muscle cells, and then the tunica media will have even more. In an atherosclerosis, these smooth muscle cells increase and take up the lipid, which then ends up bulging out into the blood vessel wall. Arteriosclerosis is related and can be caused by atherosclerosis. That's a stiffening of the blood vessel wall where it doesn't stretch as much, and therefore when we try to push blood through that and it doesn't stretch, it's going to start backing up more and increasing the force of the blood against the blood vessel walls and increase blood pressure as well. Okay, so atherosclerosis can lead to arteriosclerosis, but so can calcium deposits in the blood vessel walls and stuff like that. Okay, congestive heart failure, we've talked about that. We've mentioned it several times. And I want to relate it to edema. So, again, even though we haven't looked at the structure of blood vessel walls, when we do have a blood vessel wall pressure, blood pressure is also known as hydrostatic pressure. And that's the force of the pressure pushing against the sides of the vessel wall. If we're in an artery or a vein, we've got additional support, connective tissue and smooth muscle cells wrapping around the vessel. If it's just a capillary, then we don't have that extra support, and we have a loss of fluid into the extracellular spaces, all right? So if the pressure inside the vessel becomes too high, that increases the loss of fluid. Now, if we have left-sided congestive heart failure, that means that the left side of the ventricle is not strong enough to pump as much blood out of the ventricle as is coming in. So it starts to back up. And the first place it backs up is into the left atrium. And then it backs up into the pulmonary veins. And then it backs up into the pulmonary capillaries, which are just a simple squamous epithelium. And the pulmonary capillaries are right next to a single simple squamous wall, which is our alveolar air sac. So when fluid is pushed out by increased blood pressure, it enters into the air sac and causes pulmonary edema. It increases the diffusion distance that oxygen has to travel to get into the capillary, so we don't get as much oxygen. It increases the distance that carbon dioxide has to travel to get out, so we retain more carbon dioxide in the blood. Okay? So pulmonary edema. Now, if that continues, pressure is now going to back up into the pulmonary arteries and into the right ventricle, and from the right ventricle into the vena cavas, and from the vena cavas into our systemic capillaries. And so with right-sided congestive heart failure, we get systemic edema. So we would have our tissue capillary instead of our lung capillary. And we would have increased water ending up in our tissues. So you may see somebody with pitting edema, where their ankles are so swollen that when you push them, the dip remains. All right. Now, there can be some other causes of edema other than congestive heart failure. A woman who is pregnant may have a temporary edema because of the pressure of the enlarged uterus on her inferior vena cava, and therefore blood is blocked to some degree from returning to her heart, and pressure builds up in her lower limbs. Okay. There can be edema from someone with liver cancer or liver failure. Now, we haven't talked about the role of the liver yet, but just briefly, and I'll get to your question here in just a minute. Here would be the capillaries. Here would be the arteries and the veins. All right, so we normally have some pressure pushing water out across the capillary walls, but normally we have molecules that oppose that pressure. So if you recall from Bio 430, if we had a membrane that water molecules could pass through equally from both sides. If we put something on this side that couldn't pass through the membrane, what happened to water movement? It increased. And what do we call that pressure? Pulling the water towards the side that had all the particles, all the solid. What do we call that force? Anybody remember? Well, the diffusion of water from the high concentration of water to its low concentration is osmosis. All right. So the molecules that do this in the blood are typically proteins made by the liver. The most major one is albumin. This is not going to be on this part on the test. I'm just wanting you to realize there's other causes of systemic edema than just right-sided congestive heart failure. So if the liver can't make sufficient albumin, then regular blood pressure will push additional water out, and you'll see the person with ascites, starvation. You see the pictures of the kids that have really skinny arms and legs and big bellies. That's because the fluid building up in the abdominal cavity pushed across the peritoneum because they don't have enough of the albumin. Or someone that has liver cancer or hepatitis. For the same reason, they might have the right nutrition, but they don't have the number of cells in the liver to make those molecules. And so just a normal blood pressure will cause increased loss of fluid. Okay? High blood pressure can cause this to occur, and certainly right-sided congestive failure with the backup of fluid. Do you still remember your question?
Yeah. So does left-sided congestive heart failure cause right-sided congestive
It
heart
can, if it's there for enough period of time, because the right side of the heart has to overcome that backup of blood, and eventually it just can't. And then we end up with the pressure building up on the systemic
failure? So
system.
you can't really have a right-sided congestive heart failure without
its own?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can. Congestive heart failure often results from other causes. You can have a virus. So in the heart transplant case that we have with one of our case studies, a woman develops a viral infection and that weakens the heart. A person can be born with part of the heart muscle wall missing. So there can be a variety of causes of the actual heart weakness, or it can result from something else. You can have pulmonary hypertension as a reason that causes pulmonary edema that's not really left-sided heart failure. So there's other causes, but these can be caused by these problems with the heart. Okay? So from this aspect, even though I talked about the other, what I want you to know is, for now, we'll talk about those blood pressures when we get to the immune system, is left-sided congestive heart failure shows up as pulmonary edema. Right-sided congestive heart failure shows up as systemic edema. And all you have to do is think about where it's going to back up first. There's a question?
Oh, yes, on the congestive heart, is the ventricle walls thicker because it has to work harder?
Yeah, it's like that preload, that afterload is increasing and it's working harder and harder. Exactly right. Okay, myocardial infarction is just our fancy pathophysiological word for a heart attack, in which we have a blockage of a blood vessel and loss of oxygen to the tissue, so it dies. And it may cause instantaneous death, or it may cause a weakening of the heart, which can then lead to congestive heart failure as well. Okay, so it may or may not be fatal. That's just showing a heart on autopsy with the myocardial infarct there on the left side. All right, and then we have a blue baby. Blue baby is just a reference to congenital conditions that result in cyanosis. So when red blood cells are not carrying oxygen, they form a blue tinge. There's not actually a blue color, all right? I don't know where this starts, but my daughter, my kids in high school, thought that blood turns red when it becomes exposed to air, and it's blue when it's not. And all you have to do is look at a vial of blood that's drawn from your arm. That's venous blood, it's not blue. Okay, it's a deep dark red that becomes a bright red if it's oxygenated. So arterial blood is a bright red, venous blood is a dark red. It's not blue. It looks blue when you look at it through your skin with not enough oxygen, with not as much oxygen bound to hemoglobin. So the blue baby is referring to deoxygenated blood, okay, or not enough oxygen in the blood. So there are several causes. Usually they have the cause is something that allows the deoxygenated blood from the venous side to mix with oxygenated blood on the arterial side. So in this case, it's a patent ductus arteriosus. Remember I said that normally closes. That's that short little channel that in the fetus allows blood to not go to the lung, even though it's in the pulmonary trunk, and go back into the aorta. That's because pulmonary pressure is higher.
Is that the ligamentum?
Yeah, so it becomes a ligamentum arteriosum after birth. But before birth, pressure is higher in the pulmonary system. And so that's open, and as the blood is going out to the lungs, it's lower pressure there, and so it goes into the aorta and bypasses the lungs, same as the patent foramen ovale. Okay? So after birth, if that doesn't close, then pressure is going to be higher in the body than it is in the lungs, and it's going to be the reverse, and blood's going to flow back towards the lungs rather than going out to the body, and they're going to have less volume of oxygenated blood going to the body. Septal defects. So the upper left is a patent foramen ovale, and that's just showing the fossa ovalis hasn't formed. So again, blood that would normally be going to the lungs to get oxygen, or that has come from is lower pressure here, so blood that's normally Coming from the body, oxygenated, is going to go to the right side rather than going down to the left ventricle and then going to the body. So we're decreasing the amount of oxygenated blood going to the body. Here is a ventricular septal defect. All right? So there's a hole in the interventricular septum. And again, pressure is greater on the left side going out the aorta than it is going to the lungs. So oxygenated blood, instead of going to the body, is going to be shifted over to the lungs. And these are, usually these babies can even grow into toddlerhood, all right? They just are always tired. They might have a blue tinge to their lips. When they're playing, they'll stop and squat very often to try to increase the movement of blood. Tetralogy of Fallot, and these are all congenital defects, okay? So they're all born, these don't develop after birth. Tetralogy of Fallot are 4 separate problems. That's tetra meaning 4. You know that from our tetrad and our primary spermatocytes. So the 4 problems are an opening of ventral septal defect, a thickening of the pulmonary valves, so that means it's more difficult to get blood to go through the pulmonary trunk. So blood is diverted into the aorta because of that opening, and a thickening in the right ventricular wall because it's trying to move blood and receiving a higher resistance. Okay? So overriding aorta, opening the ventral septal defect, thickened, and pulmonary stenosis, thickening and non-closure of the valve, and a thicker right ventricle. And then the last one is transposition of the great vessels. Here we actually, instead of having an overriding aorta, we have the cycle, the entire vessels are flipped. And the aorta comes out of the right ventricle, and the pulmonary trunk comes out of the left ventricle. There's also, usually, a ventricular septal defect. And in this case, the presence of the septal defect is what keeps the person alive. If the baby didn't have that septal defect, we would have 2 completely separate circulations. And you would have the right ventricle pumping blood to the aorta, which is going to the body, and coming back to the right atrium, and being pumped to the body and coming back to the right atrium, and never going to the lungs. And you'd have the left ventricle pumping to the pulmonary trunk, going to the lungs, and coming back to the left atrium, and going to the lungs, and never going to the body. So the septal defect allows that blood to at least get mixed, so some oxygenated blood is going to the body. Now, if you recall, I talked about that 15-year-old boy that came to visit our class. He was born with transposition of the great vessels without the septal defect. So that in itself is not compatible with life. They had to do surgery immediately. They couldn't wait for him to get a little bit older, stronger. In fact, they knew about this before he was born, and they had to have the surgery completely set up and ready to go, because as soon as the umbilical cord was cut, he had no other way of getting oxygen. So they had to put him on a heart-lung machine immediately, and he had several surgeries, because as he grew older, the aorta kept narrowing, and they have to go in and open it up. Yes?
Can you actually flip the vessels back?
Surgically. Yeah. Alrighty? So we'll stop lecture with that.